Join me in today's video where I show you the design process behind this new depot shed build, as well as the beginning of its construction. Hello there, and welcome back to the railway. So the beginning of the process of building this shed has been going on for probably about 2 years, as long as the layout has been going, and the design process has started before that. The shed itself started off initially as a 4-lane engine shed, and this was the prototype that I built, which, as you can see, is only made out of 1mm grey board, very crudely made. So originally the layout had a different track plan, which I'll show you in a different video. But this shed originally was going to sit up here on the upper level section, kind of around there, but the incline used to start over there on one of the old plans. So the layout completely changed from when I had designed this shed and only had a 4-lane idea. So when I then got round to this design phase of the layout, I then designed, so I've just moved this one out of the way, I then designed this 6-lane engine shed, which, as you can see, fits the gap very well. This was the original, just a mock-up. I then painted it in black paint, and as you can see, it warped incredibly badly. So that was then just resigned to the junk pile until I needed it for this video. I then rebuilt it using a mixture of 1mm, 2mm and 3mm grey board into this shed that you see here. But on multiple times looking at it, and then looking at the roads that would go here, as well as looking at the road vehicles such as buses, cars, and then the engines themselves, it made me realise how huge this shed was in its height, and it just seems very out of scale. That when you think that you look at the gaps that you've got above the class 66 for the doorway, I can fit my finger in that gap. So for me, this design, although I liked the idea of it, the design itself was way too tall and too big. So for the next design, I'd wanted to adjust all of the heights and measurements and make it a bit less of a huge, oversized building. So that's then when this design came into fruition, with a more simplified design, with it just having, you can see it's almost as if you've got a 4-lane shed that's been built here, and then a 2-lane shed that's been built on the side. And I quite liked, I've seen on some other sheds on other people's layouts that they have this sort of, that some of them have like 3-lane sheds with a separate lane on the side. But I really liked having this like cutout almost, so you can have a loco stored coming out of this lane 2 here and have it in front of this part of the shed. I really liked how that looked on other layouts, so I thought I'd try and incorporate that into this design. As well as that, I also wanted to make this a much more detailed model than I'd had planned to with the original. Yes, the original I planned to have a little bit of an interior and detail it up, but I'd never really planned how I was going to do that while building it. Whereas this one, I have been using my laptop and SketchUp, which I shall show you later, on how I designed it and then how everything was going to slot together. And I've then also got a notebook, which I'm now going to use as a scratch building notebook, which has helped me incredibly well in terms of the measurements for this. So that's enough of me talking about these. I'm now going to show you the design process on the laptop and how I began construction of the shed. So the first shed that I showed you, the 4-lane one, that was designed initially on paint, as you will see here, and this was done with just the plan views of the model, so the front face, the back face, the top and the sides. So that was how I then did that, and then designed that into a cardboard 3D structure. I then, after building it, I then made the model in SketchUp, which I'm going to show you now. The great thing about using SketchUp to do a preliminary design 3D model online helps me to see how the shed looks with the measurements and make sure that before I transfer it into a grey board structure in the real world, make sure that all the measurements actually work as they did on that paint folder that I showed you. I also planned the Mark II shed on the paint folder, This was then using the similar measurements for the heights and the entrances into the shed itself, just moving around some of the other things. So, for example, the roof went and sloped the opposite way due to where this shed was actually going to be situated on the layout, so that the viewpoint would look nice from a certain angle instead of how it was with the Mark 1 shed. I didn't really do that much of a two-dimensional plan for the Mark 3 shed which I'm building today, but I did a rough design, as you will see here, which gave me an idea of how I wanted the shed itself to be structured and how it wanted it to look. It was from these rough initial measurements that I then spent the next couple of days, if not about a week, designing this final shed which you can see here in the 3D model of SketchUp. This is a very helpful system because you can do it all to scale, as you can see with the human standing in the background. So you can get a nice idea as well of how all the different roof sections interact with one another. So it's going to be quite complicated to do some of the roofs. The section on the front, where you can see now with all of the windows on, that is going to be built in a separate video, and I'll then add that onto the side. So that'll be just like a visitor centre area with a shop. The upper level, which you can see on the top, is going to be more like a restaurant cafe area, maybe with a back room area. And the viewing gallery on the right hand side of the shed, which you can see the bottom of, that section is going to be more like a bar area with a viewing gallery over the main tracks. So for those of you who are new to the layout, this shed has been influenced from the engine house on the Severn Valley Railway, with how that has its visitor centre built into that shed, and it's also been influenced by the Gloucestershire-Warwickshire Steam Railway. I think it's the steam depot at Toddington that has a 6-lane engine shed. So it's had a bit of influence from both of those in its design process, and then I've tried to then merge it together and then add a couple of my own ideas to it. So that's been really fun to do. So now I'll just show you how I began construction of this model using greyboard. So it started off with measurements in between the tracks on the hard standing area, so that I could measure out the distances in between each of the entrances into the shed, so that I knew how wide each of the doorway entrances would need to be. After that, I was then able to get the measurements for the rear of the shed as well, and I then used the same piece of greyboard so that the angles for the roof were the exact same. I then did the measurements for the side of the building, having to take into account as well that the greyboard I was using was 1mm thick, so I needed to make sure that the thickness of the greyboard was taken into account with the measurements of the sides. While doing the measurements for the other side of the engine shed, I also needed to take into account that I was going to be putting this balcony section on the back, and I wanted this to remain flush with the top of the wall, so I needed to create a 1mm notch, as you will see in the piece of greyboard at the top of the screen here, so that balcony could then slot in and keep everything flush. I then used these measurements to create the floor plan, the 2 outer walls and the 2 inner walls as they were, all while taking into account the millimetre deviations that I would need to have for some of the measurements with the 1mm thickness of the greyboard. So once all of those components had been cut out of their frames, I then started work on the actual doorways and the entrance to this section of the viewing area. Firstly, removing sections of the greyboard so that I could fit doors slightly recessed from the front, as well as then some holes for some windows I would be putting in as well. For each of the 3 doorways, I then also cut out each window section on each door, and my goodness was that fiddly to do. I had printed these doorways from the Scale Scenes website onto just ordinary printer paper, so it was a bit thinner for me to cut through with a very sharp knife. So this made it reasonably easy to cut these windows out, but I had to be incredibly accurate not to go too far with the scalpel blade. The time spent doing this though was well worth it, and it gives you a brilliant view into the bar behind the viewing area, as well as the private function room on the right hand side. The designs for the floor and the actual wooden bar itself I made on paint and then printed those off onto ordinary printer paper to then just glue those using a Pritt stick just on top of the grey board. And the wine racks or bottle racks that are behind the bar, I just went online and found a picture of a bar and then just used that to duplicate it across a couple of times to then create this kind of shelving effect, which I think worked really well. With this section of the build completed, I then moved my attention onto the main restaurant cafe upstairs area on the other side of the shed. So I once again started off using the printer paper with the paint effect flooring on. I applied that once again using Pritt stick to, I think that was 2mm grey board I used for the actual floor itself to help it give a bit of rigidity, all while leaving the end walls, the internal wall and the side wall all using a 1mm grey board just to keep the thicknesses of those sections consistent. At this point, I then began adding the decorative paper to the outside sections of some of the walls. These were the sections that then wouldn't need any like 1mm overlap when it was constructed. So some sections I did leave without any of this on, as it would then mean I'd have to have a 1mm overlay, which then I didn't want to mess up any of the tolerances. So I thought I would add that on afterwards when most of the building has been completed. Anyway, so for the top section of all that you can see here, this is the back panel of the shed. The corrugated looking effect isn't actually corrugated. It's meant to look like it for the building that I'm doing, but it's actually wood panelling on scale scenes. This was printed on very thin, I say thin, it's probably the same sort of thickness as probably maybe 0.5 mm, I would say. So it's a lot thicker than paper, so it gives it a little bit of a recess compared to the brick paper on the bottom, where that is done based just on plain paper. So then it makes it look like it is sat slightly on top of the brickwork. Once that was dry, I then started gluing together some of the main sections of this side of the shed using the floor panel, as you can see here, as well as the side. And then I also added the front on, which once again I had added the corrugated effect paper to, as well as the brickwork around the bottoms of each of the entrances. I used some set squares as well, just to make sure that all of these sections of wall and floor all stayed at 90 degrees to each other while they were drying. I then just carried on this process for the rest of the shed, and eventually I then had a completed frame. For the upper cafe or restaurant style area, I did all of the internal walls, making sure all of them were detailed enough for this stage. I will be adding some bookshelves detail afterwards, but I just wanted to get the main framework done. So the walls on the right hand side have all had the glazing fitted, as well as the internal paper wall, just using white spare printer paper. I then did actually apply some detailed corrugated effect paper on the outside, but I had forgotten about the 1mm tolerance either side with the grey board walls on the opposite angles, so I'll need to add another layer of paper on the outside of that to make sure there's no grey board showing through. I didn't do the internal walls or the glazing on the left hand side of the building. That was mainly because I hadn't done the outside panel and I needed to keep those windows open in order for me to be able to cut the window sections into them without having any inaccuracies, because I've done that with other sections after I've put the glazing in, and it's incredibly difficult getting the holes to cut through exact perfectly unless I leave the glazing out and cut through the hole that's already there. So that's what I've left those out for, and then I will glue those in afterwards after most of the external work has been done. So back to the internal work. With the secondary viewing area that I had completed earlier in the video, as you'd seen, I needed now a way to mount this in its position in the shed without it falling into the shed, basically. So I needed to make a couple of struts to go along the X and Y axis of the shed in order to keep it at the right height, the right level, so it's all perpendicular with all the other walls that it needed to be and parallel with the other ones. So that's what these sections are that I'm showing you here. The section that connected underneath the two floors of the viewing area and the restaurant area, they needed to be slightly different heights, as the viewing area that was being attached in only had a 1mm base of grey board, whereas the restaurant cafe area, that has a 2mm base of grey board. So I needed to make something that then had all of the measurements line up, that then slotted into the gap without having any drooping. So I needed to make it thick enough using 2mm grey board on the bottom, but then raise the height on it on the right hand side so it then matched the same height that the viewing area needed to be. So after a lot of time spent fiddling with all these different measurements, I then managed to fit this section into the shed, and as you can see from these images, it held its weight perfectly and was suspended. Although I did find that the front of the shed did seem to have a bit of a wobble, so I added another strut, which you can see just above the Class 66s here. This just kind of prevented the front section of the shed from twisting back and forth, because if I picked the shed up and moved it from side to side, the front entrances of the 4 lanes was wobbling quite a lot, with it only being 1mm thickness of the front and the 2 sides. So it was then just trying to strengthen up the front section of it, basically using that underlevel. So that's going to bring this video to an end. I haven't finished the shed, obviously. That will come in future videos. I plan on doing the roof section as one video. The outer building section, that also might be a separate video as well. And I do have an idea of how I might want to have opening doors on the loco entrances. So what I might try and do, whether that be with cocktail sticks, matchsticks and pieces of string, where I can open and shut the doors manually, or do I do something that's motorised that then might take me a bit longer to do, but then say I have a button on the baseboard that I can then press and the doors of the shed then open. Just trying to decide which way I would want to go about it, but that's something that would then mean I would need to make part of the roof removable to keep that section maintained. So thank you for watching today's video. If you have enjoyed, please don't forget to like the video and indeed subscribe to the channel. Don't forget, subscribing is free. There is also a notification icon that you can click. It's just the bell next to the subscribe button. This will notify you every time that one of my videos goes live. I have quite a few in the pipeline that I'm going to be making. So I have Revolution Trains Class 66 review video coming out in the near future, as I'm just waiting at the moment for my final Revolution Trains Class 66 to arrive. Well, it's the final one for now, who knows, there could be more in the future. Anyway, so as well as that video, there is also going to be a video on the upper branch line section, as I've started to fix some more of the track down. I've now got the bridge itself is glued in place, so it's just going to be a video with a culmination of different updates, as well as I've now painted the station buildings as well as the footbridge that goes across the station buildings, so that will be all in a future video as well. So yeah, lots to look forward to on the layout, with lots of progress going on, as well as a couple of new models. So once again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.